Don't worry, what I'm talking about today will not do that. It will instead try to help to make your job easier, to make it faster, and let you focus on other things. But essentially the first question we can ask is, how can AI and design build better experiences? When it comes to information architecture, from what I understand, a very important component of it is guiding users through multiple steps and organizing the information and the structure of a website or a software in a way that they can see it. And I want you all to look at this next slide. I bet most of you looked at the first your eyes here first, and then the then here second. Why I wanted to put this slide here is an oversimplification of Gestalt psychology. The idea that as human beings, we're constantly looking at such a chaotic environment. Our brain naturally finds kind of rules of thumbs and visual cues to determine what is the most important thing to focus on first, then second, then third, then fourth. Now, if I asked you what is the visual hierarchy, essentially, of this design, it's very obviously the top line, then the second. But if I asked you what is the hierarchy of this design, now it becomes a lot more complicated. And I bet in your jobs and in your projects, most of you aren't working on this. You're working on something much more complicated like this. So when it comes to this, the question becomes, how do we interpret this? How do we figure out if this is an effective visual hierarchy? Are users looking at the content we want them to look at? And in the past, up to today, we have a few methods at our disposal. So the first is usability studies, more advanced user studies. Bring users into a room, put them into a panel, ask them some questions, have them do these tasks. This is phenomenal for qualitative insights. This is something every team should be doing. I think more should be doing way more of it. The problem with it, when it actually comes to interpreting what users looked at, and if they actually saw the content you wanted to look at first, often you can ask them to recall and they're wrong. We actually, last month, did a major study. We're trying to understand the visibility of ads. And we did a very simple study to see if users actually knew the ads they looked at. So what we did is we would show them two ads side by side and have them click left or right depending on which one they saw first. The trick is at the same time we had eye tracking gear connected to them. About 70% of the time they were wrong, including me. We don't mean to lie to ourselves, but our subconscious brain sees things that our conscious brain doesn't realize it. So usability studies are phenomenal for more qualitative insights, but when it comes to the idea of that, it's not as good. If you want to do the real thing, you should really do eye tracking to understand it. This can come in many forms. You can outsource to usability labs, people do this professionally. You can buy Tobii eye tracking gear and do it yourself. The limitation with this is quite expensive. And a similar limitation with actually doing usability studies is because it takes time, it's expensive in terms of your team's resources. And because these things take a lot of time and aren't feasible to bring into your daily workflow, a process that should be very scientifically driven, very objectively driven, often ends up looking a lot more like this. And you can tell me if you guys are not guilty of ever being in a discussion like this, where you end up spending an hour arguing about the color green or orange or blue or the texture copy you want to put on a button, and ultimately the highest paid person gets to come in and decide who does it. So what we see here is a gap in the space between the understanding and objective decisions we want to make when it comes to design and what we can actually feasibly do. And this is the gap that AI can try to solve. So this is my company. It's iQuant. We started back in 2009 at the University of Osnabrück, about 4 hours west of here in Germany. And it started just as a simple university project. Could they build an algorithm that could predict the results of an eye tracking study? Essentially, we've kind of taken that philosophy and expanded it, made it much more sophisticated, but the idea is actually quite simple. And the type of AI we're talking about really is machine learning. And the idea is going out and doing large-scale user studies. In this first case what I'm talking about is actually eye tracking in a lab, looking at websites. Feeding that data into machine learning algorithms that then basically teach itself and find the statistical patterns between the characteristics of an individual design and ultimately how those influence the way users saw it. So when you go and upload a design into iQuant today, let's say you're working on this category page or listing page for jeans. What iQuant will do is it'll extract 40 different features from it. Things, variety of contrast, colors, lines, edge density, things like entropy, dimensive control quality. And then what it'll do is basically, because of that research, understand how that influences users. So the product basically now is a simulation of eye tracking. And one thing to keep in mind is that when you simulate user research, it is not the same as the real thing. There is a trade-off. It's about 85% is accurate, in this case 83. You can go up, go down. But essentially, the trade-off comes in the fact that instead of having to wait weeks or months or never doing it, you can do it in a matter of seconds. But the reason I want to bring this up in my talk today is because of the use of artificial intelligence, we can now run these so many times we can learn some design patterns that otherwise would have taken years of eye tracking studies in order to learn. So the first question though is, just because you know where users are looking, how does that matter if you don't know how to influence basically the results? So if you look at a design like this is an older landing page for Spotify when they're doing a promotion for 3 months off. You can see obviously there's a lot of attention on the logo here, the 3 months premium, not a whole lot on their button for learn more, some information going down. I think in this particular case, AI cannot do the job of a UX designer or UX team to decide what is the important content for users to look at. This is something that you and your business only know. The computer doesn't know this. We have a framework that we use. It's not necessarily true, but I think a big part of your job is determining that important content. But for the particular case what I'm showing today, I'm going to use this framework for how to make an effective landing page. And essentially the idea we have is that the best designs immediately convey these 3 things to a user. The first is, what is the page about? Is the offer they're giving relevant? Are they in the right spot? The second is, why should they care? What is the value of your offering? What is your value proposition? What should motivate them to act? And then the third is, now that you motivate them to act, where should they go next? What's the next step in the funnel? Essentially the call to action. So if we look at this design, we can see, okay, we know we're looking at Spotify. It'll probably come from some advertising. We know it's music. We see a value proposition of 3 months premium for 99 cents. That's an awesome deal. But the call to action isn't nearly as eye-catching. So I want to kind of give you in this talk a few tips and tricks before I move on to the next topic. One tip for driving user attention, and I think everybody in this room knows it but maybe underutilizes it, is the simple use of contrast. Using contrast to guide users' eyes, particularly luminance contrast, the difference in contrast between an element and its background and its surroundings. So I changed the button here, and please forgive any designs I do here. I'm not that good of a designer. I basically do this very quickly. Change the button simply to green. Still matches the brand guidelines instead of being the purple it was in the background. And by using a simple tool of contrast, we now see that all 3 of our key points, including our call to action, have the heat. And we have a good visual hierarchy where people are seeing what it's about, why they should care, and we're driving their attention to a key piece of content, which is what we want them to do next, and hopefully what they want to do, which is learn more. The second, I think, is a simple rule of thumb, and is often hard to persuade because there's so many stakeholders who have their say in design, not just the design team, but marketing as well. Remove potential distractors. So you go shopping on this JCPenney site. I think I was doing this before Christmas. This banner here was sticky. I saw this the entire experience. Yet when I wanted to come to the time to buy this polo shirt, it's still there. Now if we look at the actual data on what people are looking at, so this is the same as the eye tracking data, just a different map we use called the perception map. It's kind of like highlighting what is the first 3 seconds of what users will look at. And we see that at this point in my journey, the best thing I should be looking at to give me the experience I want is actually the shirt itself, more information, and how to add it to the cart to ultimately buy it. Yet instead, I'm being driven towards this banner on top that I've already seen the entire time and I've already chosen to ignore. A simple trick is eliminated. Now this is a very simple case, but literally by just cutting that out, we now have driven my attention to the actual product information and to the next step of what you want me to do. Just to use as kind of ammunition when marketing is demanding you have to put this thing on the website and you want to say, no, we want to drive it to other areas. And the third, this is one of the simplest tricks that is the least underutilized, and is actually what we found through all of our research to be ridiculously true, is what we call the location or the spatial bias. What we find is users are trained over time on how to expect things to come on the internet, on a screen. And one way we're trained is to recognize important things are generally in the center left, and the upper left of the screen. I think this is particularly strong because we read left to right. The spatial bias, we haven't done a lot of studies on this, is actually opposite when it comes to people reading Arabic or Hebrew or Asian countries that read left to right. But essentially, the idea is if you have core content you want users to see, sometimes just moving into this area can drive way more attention to it. So here's an example of Neiman Marcus. Let's say in theory, we really wanted to drive much more attention to this component instead of the shoe at this stage. A simple trick is literally flip it. And then if you look at the results, now we see much more attention on this area simply because it's on the opposite side of the screen, just because that's how users are trained to look at the web. Now, the first part I want to talk about was how to drive attention to the right areas. But the topic of this entire day is how to use IA for good. And what I want to talk about now is ultimately how AI has taught us to avoid bad, and particularly how to avoid bad patterns of design. Who here knows Ling's cars? If you've ever been to this site, it is ridiculous. There's noises, sound, a bunch of things coming out, the motorcycle drives at you, and the founder, Ling, is actually singing in the background, and there's a bunch of ping pongs and noise. I love this example because it is an outlier. Outliers do work. This is this site's gimmick. It's actually incredibly successful. So one might say maybe this is how we should make the entire web. Now imagine if every single website you went on had flashing noises and you went on Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg was singing. This would be a terrible experience. This is the epitome of clutter. But what makes a design cluttered versus clear? I mean, it's very obvious why Ling's cars is incredibly cluttered. But what if I asked you if this design was too cluttered? What if I asked you if this design was too cluttered? What if I asked you if this design was too cluttered? Again, we find, as practitioners working in the trees, that it's actually a lot harder to determine this. So this presents the second opportunity for artificial intelligence to come and actually aid our work. So this is what we've done at iQuant. We decided, could we build an algorithm that can predict how users would perceive the clarity of a design and rank it on a scale. And the method we ultimately ended up going with that worked was very, very large-scale forced-choice tasks. Ultimately, putting in front of users two designs side by side and asking them to choose within a matter of seconds. So they're choosing based off of the visual components, not actually the messaging. They couldn't have enough time to read. Which design is more clean? And you do this with randomized pairs with thousands of users over time, and you can ultimately come up with a scale. That's actually supposed to say 100 over there, but basically, very cluttered designs on the lower end, very clean and clear designs on the upper end, and average being about a 50. So if we look at the sites of today, Ling's cars ultimately scores a 2, no surprise. Yet to see a 0, I'm hoping. I actually think I ran his recently, it went down to a 1, it's got slightly worse. We see that the Amazon Echo design was not as cluttered as a lot of the e-commerce we see today, but still has some room for improvement. And of course we have Google up at 93, but who can compete with that? But ultimately, in my talks with designers, I feel like UX designers and people that work in this field don't have a hard time accepting the idea that cleaner, clearer designs are better for users, that a more clear experience makes it easier for them to find things and move in the journey. But the problem is, designers are also salespeople. And designers have to sell this idea to their teams. And I talk with designers and UX teams almost all day, every day. And one of the biggest problems they have is, this is awesome, we get that we can measure clarity, but how do I pitch this to my boss's boss? How do I get buy-in? And this has come up so many times over the years. This summer we said, screw it, let's try to find a way to speak the language of the marketing execs, a language they understand, which isn't clarity, but is ultimately ROI. So what we did is we went out and we collected the top 300 websites on the internet from a variety of industries and categories. And we collected their bounce rates. And then we ran those sites with their bounce rates through iQuant to see if there was a correlation between visual clarity and whether or not people decided to stay on the website. And what we found was actually quite phenomenal and quite surprising that there is a clear correlation between visual clarity and bounce rates, and it's negative. Ultimately, the cleaner and clearer you can get the design, the far less likely people are to leave immediately. This didn't make up the entire decision, but it ultimately made up 1/3 of the variance between bounce rates was explained by clarity. So ultimately, if you can have a clean, clear design, you've at least got 33% of the way of keeping a user from immediately bouncing and closing their tabs. And this essentially makes sense. We live in a time when we're bombarded with information constantly. We're bombarded with messages. We have to ignore so much. It's the cleanest, clearest one that makes the most sense in the time that ultimately makes it through. So just to give you some takeaways, what factors have we found using AI now, and run thousands of these now, that really ultimately we believe drive clarity? And to use this, I want to give an example of 2 different product detail pages of the exact same project. This is Paula's Choice. I believe this was like the UK or the international site that their entire website looked like, but for some reason the Americans had a different team and they updated it. And at one point we thought, wow, this is an amazing case to show the difference. So the original scores a 26, and the one on the right scores an 85. And I don't think anyone in this room would argue that this one is way cleaner and clearer, and has way less clutter than that. But I also really want to highlight what is potentially contributing the most to clutter. So if you look at this design, it's very dense text and quite a lot of it. Users naturally punish text. I think when we want to read, we're happy to have a bunch of text thrown at us, but otherwise it's like, whoa, back off. I don't want to read a novel right now, I was just trying to buy my skincare. A lot of text. There's always a trade-off, of course, and I'm going to go into this a bit later. You have to have essential text, you can't cut everything. But ultimately, this is kind of overkill. Again, too, if you do have text, there's no padding in it whatsoever, so this looks like a little block to users. There's a lot of sharp contrast. The entire website is basically black and white. Very high contrast. Again, they're not using contrast to guide the attention to any particular part. They're using contrast throughout the entire thing. So essentially, it's seen as cluttered. You're being directed towards the entire site. And of course, the choice was a lot of small images. And then if you look at the one that scored phenomenally higher, in this particular case, they narrowed down the text to the essentials only. If you actually go below the fold, if you're curious and are the buyer that wants to read a lot of information and read more, you can. But in this case, when it came to this part of the funnel, they decided just the essential information. They added more padding between the text so that it's easier on the eyes, it's easier for you to interpret and to read. A lot fewer sharp contrasts, and that's in part because they're using much understated typeface. And of course, the highest contrast item right here is your call to action, which is the step you want them to take. And they use a larger image. Instead of having a variety of it, just one simple large image, which makes sense, you're trying to buy here. And then here's just one example of how clarity has actually worked in the real world to get people to ultimately do what they wanted to do. This is an example of British Gas. They had a lot of trouble with their boiler landing page here. Ultimately, they realized that it was ridiculously cluttered design, users were immediately bouncing and nobody was signing up. So they cleaned it up and ultimately made a focus, text with padding, focused on the key essential information, and made the design as simple as possible. But to conclude, essentially what I want to talk to you today was how to use AI to enable your work and to better understand how users are looking at your designs and build an architecture that is actually guiding their eyes to the right spots. But most importantly, kind of the mission we have at iQuant, it's a bit cheesy, but it's using this clarity score and using this information to preach the word of clarity so that we're all building web experiences that are actually cleaner and clearer and a lot easier for users to use, and ultimately a better experience online. Thank you.